Hi guys, in this video we will be learning about international trade and access to markets, as well as barriers to trade and patterns of international trade.
Firstly, we're going to look at international trade and access to markets. And firstly, we're going to begin by looking at what is comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is essentially the reason why countries trade with each other. And the theory behind it is that countries should specialise in producing goods or services that they excel at producing, which means the things that they are good at producing. And this means that by producing those things they're good at producing, they can then trade for the things that they aren't good at producing. So for example, if we take the example of two countries, one is good at growing bananas and not good at growing apples, and the other country is good at growing apples but not good at growing bananas, they grow the item that they're best at growing, and then they can trade with the other one for the other item so that both countries have a supply of apples and bananas. And this also makes trade easier through having fewer barriers to trade, which will allow the countries to trade with each other for the items that they can't produce themselves. So theoretically, production should increase because of comparative advantage, both nationally and globally, and this is why each country concentrating on what they produce best. However, in the 20th century, trade has been limited due to regulations, protectionism, and high transport costs, so production hasn't increased as much as it has theoretically been expected to because of these limitations, but the removal of trade barriers will increase this amount of trade. So essentially what comparative advantage is, it's countries focusing on the items that they produce the best and then trading those for the items that they aren't good at producing. I previously just mentioned the role of barriers to trade and how this is reducing trade on both national and global scales. So now we're going to look at some of the barriers to trade and the idea of protectionism. Now, trade barriers are government-imposed restraints on the flow of international goods or services. So essentially they are restrictions on trade. And they can take the form of different types of trade barriers. So we have what are called trade tariffs, which are taxes on imports. So countries will have to pay a certain amount of money in order to trade. So that's what a tariff is, it's a tax. And tariffs tend to be the most common trade barrier that we see. Although free trade has had a huge role recently in removing the practice of protectionism, and it's a strategy essentially used by governments to protect their established or emerging industries from trading with other countries. However, free trade has acted to erode this type of protectionism that countries enforce by enforcing things like tariffs and trade barriers. So free trade is combating trade barriers, essentially. And now we're briefly going to look at some of the other barriers to trade, beginning with import licenses. Now, import licenses are licenses which are issued by a national government, and they authorise the importation of goods from a specific source. Then we have what are called import quotas, and these set a physical limit on the quantity of goods that can be imported into a country. Then we have subsidies, and subsidies are grants or allowances which are awarded to domestic producers. So domestic producers are producers within a country, essentially. And these help to reduce their costs and make them more competitive against imported goods. So a lot of the time, consumers within a country will be buying these imported goods, which puts strains and actually has negative effects on the growers within a country. So grants or allowances are therefore given to these domestic producers to help them compete with the international market, essentially, and so that the domestic producers don't suffer. And we also have what are called export subsidies, and these encourage domestic producers to sell their goods abroad. And another point about subsidies is that, as I mentioned before, through allowing the domestic producers to reduce their costs, This makes their cost cheaper in supermarkets, for example, so that people are more likely to buy these cheaper goods, and this will help domestic producers rather than help the international imported goods. Then we have what are called voluntary export restraints, and this is a diplomatic strategy which is offered by exporting countries to appease the importing country and deter it from imposing trade barriers. So it's essentially, if one country wants to import something into another country, it will often kind of give the other country that it wants to import into almost like a gift to make sure that they're on good terms, for example, and to stop them from imposing trade barriers on this country, which will make it more difficult to trade with them. So it kind of enables trade through giving these voluntary exports restraints. Next, we have embargoes, and embargoes are either partial or complete prohibitions of commerce and trade with a particular country. These often occur for more political reasons rather than commercial reasons. For example, if two countries are at war, they will put an embargo on trade for political reasons rather than trade reasons, as I just stated before, so as to almost damage another country's economies in some way by restricting the goods that they are allowed. For example, if a country has been behaving badly and their policies and so on aren't agreeing with other countries, they can enact these embargoes as a sort of punishment, really. And then finally, we have trade restrictions, and trade restrictions are types of import restrictions, and they can be sometimes technical or regulatory obstacles, such as the quality standard of goods being imported. So they regulate the quality, that's really important, or they regulate how things are produced. So for example, in the EU, we have EU quality standards to make sure that products are of a certain level and they meet these standards, otherwise they will not be able to be traded. And for example, in relation to how products are produced, the EU also restricts goods which are knowingly produced using child labour. So these are sort of trade restrictions. We're talking about quality and also the method of production. So most countries are against the use of, for example, slave labour or child labour, so they refuse to import these goods on those grounds. Now we're going to look at trends in the volume and pattern of international trade, starting by looking at the patterns. And we're going to look at some of the trends throughout the 20th century. So firstly, we have the emergence of the free market, and this formed at the end of the 20th century, and this saw a push to removing trade barriers, particularly in relation to international trade. And along with this, with an increase in things like mobility and the improvements in production, especially what's called regional trade agreements, these emerged, and the global trade framework was also strengthened by what was called the GATT, which is established in 1947, which stands for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And this was essentially established after World War II had ended to kind of set some regulation on trade across the world. However, the GATT was replaced by the World Trade Organization in 1995, and this continued to work in the aim of creating free trade across the world and essentially removing trade barriers, as we saw here with the emergence of the free market, with free trade as its main aim. So essentially the first trend that we have is the emergence of the free market and the development of the GATT and the World Trade Organization, with the aims of making trade increasingly more free, with the aim eventually of completely free trade between different countries internationally. As a result of this, reaching agreements on trade and removing trade barriers hasn't been easy at all, but average trade tariffs have shrunk to a tenth of their level when the GATT began operating in 1947. So as we can see, this means that trade is becoming increasingly more free, and also world trade has increased at a faster rate than global economic growth. and the flow of most products has eased in recent years. However, in recent years, particularly since the global financial crisis, which occurred in 2008 and 2009, global agreements have become increasingly difficult to reach because of this financial crisis. And overall, international trade flows are still expanding, but they haven't yet regained the pace of the 1990s and 2000 when trade was really booming due to this major recession that occurred, and this recession therefore kind of stalled trade in a way, although trade is beginning to pick up again following the financial crisis that occurred. And we're going to be looking at some of the global patterns of interregional trade shown by this map, which represented patterns of interregional trade in 2011. So as we can see, patterns of trade are changing all the time, and this has been due to globalization and the greater integration of different economies. But as we can see overall, trade is still dominated by a few large economic blocs, which are regions like North America, Europe and Asia, mostly facilitated by China and Japan, and places like Korea and Taiwan as well. And overall, the USA and Germany and Japan alone account for 25% of global trade overall, while the other G7 countries, which include countries like the UK, Canada, Italy and France, which are essentially the other main strongest economies in the world, they together account for nearly 50% of global trade combined with that. So as we can see, it's the more economically developed countries in the world which are still dominating trade globally. And however, the important thing to learn about this now is that the dominance of these countries, so USA, Germany, Japan, and the other G7 countries, are now being challenged by the emerging economies, which account for a growing share, and this is growing year by year. And now China accounts for the largest growth. And these changes are being reflected in the balance of transoceanic trade. And now trans-Pacific trade is actually growing faster than transatlantic trade occurring over here. And here we have trans-Pacific trade going on. So the emerging countries within Asia are getting stronger. Their trade alliances with other countries are growing as well. So these countries and their economies will grow even more in the years to come and will challenge the dominance of the traditional, more developed countries, such as those in North America and Europe and so on. So now we're going to learn a bit more about these international trade patterns. And just to recap the trends that I just showed you on the map, the international trade patterns are being influenced by greater integration of economies and have typically been dominated by North America, Europe and Eastern Asia, such as countries like Japan and Taiwan. However, currently, USA, Germany, Japan account for 25%, and the other G7 countries have accounted for 50% of international trade. But the main point we need to learn about the changing patterns is that the dominance is being challenged by the emerging economies, such as China. China is really, really important, and China's seen the largest growth in recent years. So that's just a recap, to show you some notes on the map that I was just talking about. So that's the current predictions, but now I'm going to talk a bit about the forecast for the future by looking at what we expect to be happening in world trade by 2020. So by 2020, world trade in goods will total to about 35 trillion US dollars, and services will be about 6 trillion US dollars. So, these are really substantial figures, and it just shows how important trade is to the global economy. Intra-regional trade within Europe will be worth more than 7 trillion US dollars, which is still going to be more than in Asia. So Asia won't have caught up with Europe by then, standing at about 5 trillion US dollars at that point. Also, the Asia-Pacific region will experience the fastest growth in global trade. And there will also be some growth in sub-Saharan African countries as they develop, and they possibly will become the points for the assembly of finished goods and so on. And also, Europe will be the most important market for sub-Sahara's exports. So Europe essentially will be the consumers of the products produced in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's one relationship which will be really important for the future. And also the machinery and transport sector, which includes things like consumer electrical products such as phones and so on, will make the largest contribution to trade. And we can really see this just in global trends, that the world is becoming increasingly reliant upon telecommunications, and even people in the poorest countries now have access to mobile technology. So this is going to be the largest growing sector in world trade. Moving on from trends in trade, we're now going to look at trends in investment. Firstly, looking at foreign direct investment, otherwise known as FDI. And foreign direct investment is an important source of funding for development in all countries, especially for the least economically developed countries, which are the poorest countries in the world. And these are the countries that are wanting to catch up with the richer countries. And whether these countries are just beginning to modernize or they're part of the rich oil groups, it is difficult to jumpstart any economy without an injection of capital, and capital is money. So foreign direct investment is essentially other countries injecting money into another country, and this is going to boost their financial growth. So FDI, or foreign direct investment, is really important for the economic growth of many countries, especially the poorest countries. And each year, more than $1 trillion of foreign direct investment flows into countries all around the world, but the distribution of this foreign direct investment is not equal. So it's not equally shared between countries. There are some countries which are receiving more foreign direct investment than others, and these are the top recipients of FDI in the world, with the USA being at the top. And here we have a mixture of emerging economies and the most developed countries. So we have USA, China, Belgium, Hong Kong, Brazil, Australia, Singapore, Russia, France, and Canada. So you can see it's mostly dominated by the most developed countries. However, we do have emerging countries like China and Brazil and Hong Kong, as well as Singapore and Russia, which is a former communist country as well in this list. And these are the top recipients of FDI. So as you can see, the main recipients of FDI are not the poorest country in the world, but these poorest countries really do rely on foreign direct investment for their economic growth. And some of the factors that influence the amount of foreign direct investment a country will get depends on its natural resources, things like forests, also oil and water, for example. If the country has a lot of these or is rich in natural resources, they might receive a lot more foreign direct investment from other countries who are interested in these resources. Often it's also related to population size and also the size of their economic market. So the main attractions for FDI, as I just mentioned, are a plentiful supply of natural resources. For example, you can see in that list we had countries like Brazil, who have the Amazon rainforest. Also, Canada was up there as well, which has a plentiful supply of wood from forests and oil. And also countries like China, who don't have many natural resources, but have the resource of a huge population, currently the largest population in the world. So it's not only physical things like land or oil or water or wood, for example. Populations are also a commodity because of the workforces, for example. So this is also a big attraction for foreign direct investments. They also need to have large and accessible consumer markets and also good financial services as well. So now that we've looked at trends in trade and investment, we're now going to look at the concept of fair trade and ethical investment. And you might recognize this logo from some food that you might eat, and this is the logo of Fair Trade. And here we have the World Fair Trade Organization's Millennium Development Goals, which are the 10 principles of fair trade. And we're going to learn a bit now about what fair trade exactly is. So the goal of fair trade, and this is something we need to remember, is to help producers in developing countries achieve better trading conditions and promote sustainability. So sustainability is a key factor here, and also achieving better trading conditions is the other main factor. And it's usually related to agricultural-based products. One kind of very common agricultural-based product which is involved in fair trade is the production of coffee, and also things like handcrafts and valuable minerals such as diamonds and gold found in less economically developed countries. And fair trade is to help them and the producers not to be taken advantage of by larger countries and so on, and so that they achieve the best trading conditions possible and they get what they deserve for the resources that they sell on. And the other part of fair trade is that it's trying to help these smaller agricultural farmers and so on gain more influence in governing market conditions, and to give them the power to negotiate better deals with big companies and so on. So, for example, you might have a small farmer selling to a large company, and a lot of the time these large companies will take advantage of the small farmer. He won't know exactly how much his products are worth, so they will try and get the best deal possible. But fair trade is trying to help these small farmers get what they deserve, so they're not mistreated by either countries or big corporations. However, what we need to realise is that fair trade is not free trade. So free trade is the removal of trade barriers. However, fair trade is a process of helping small-scale producers in gaining fair trading conditions and sustainability. So now that we've looked at fair trade, we're now going to look at ethical investment. And ethical investment is a type of ethical consumerism. So consumerism is the process of buying things in an ethical manner. So this is respecting kind of environmental and human rights and so on. And essentially, this type of consumerism involves investors making a choice based on a company's activities, but it's also on a smaller scale based on personal principles and beliefs. So, for example, many governments do not invest in any companies involved with tobacco, firearms, or those companies that use polluting energy. So they don't want to be associated with these damaging kind of processes. So essentially what ethical investment is a socially responsible choice. So taking the example of tobacco is the product contained within cigarettes, and cigarettes are linked to lung cancer, which is very bad. So a lot of companies won't want to invest in a tobacco company for its link to cancer, which is a negative effect on humanity, essentially. And also, for example, those countries which are involved in a lot of pollution, other companies don't want to invest in other companies that are related to such pollution effects because they're damaging the world, and they don't want to invest in further damage to the Earth's environment. But this is taken onto a more social or human level, whereas some people won't want to buy from any clothing shop or food shop, for example, that's related to child labour, or sweatshops where people have to work in unfair or cruel environments to produce these clothes. So a lot of people might boycott a certain company. Companies like Nike and Primark in the past have seen people boycott them for their use of sweatshops and unfair labour and slave labour in the past. So it's essentially people choosing to associate themselves and consume from companies that treat the environment and humans and animals respectfully.
Hi guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're looking for an amazing A-level geography resource, join me today in my series of engaging bite-sized video tutorials. See you soon, and together let's make A-level geography a walk in the park.